Matthew chapter 14. John the Baptist beheaded. Now, if you haven't been following, John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin, just to put that in perspective. Alright, so at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. "This is John the Baptist," he told his servants. "He has been raised from the dead, and that's why supernatural powers are at work with him." So he's saying this about Jesus, who is not John the Baptist. They both walked at the same time. They couldn't be the same person. But what you're not seeing here is Herod's feeling a lot of guilt. Herod had John the Baptist beheaded, thrown in prison and beheaded. And that's all, well, here we go. It's going to tell about it. So he is living with great guilt, and that's why he's saying this. For Herod, verse 3, had arrested John, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, since John had been telling him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." Though he wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd, since they regarded him as a prophet. So Herodias is sleeping with his brother's wife, and John's telling him, you can't do that. It's wrong for you to do that. You're breaking the law. So Herod had wanted to kill John the Baptist, but he was afraid to do it. And all indications are he stayed afraid, clearly. Verse 6, but when Herod's birthday celebration came, Herodias' daughter danced before them and pleased Herod. So he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. And prompted by her mother, she answered, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." Although the king regretted it, he commanded that it be granted because of his oaths and his guests. Alright, so we just read he wanted to kill John the Baptist, but he was afraid to do so. So even now, he regretted it. So this is not what he wanted to do, but he just said he was going to do it in front of everyone because she danced for him. And so now he's got to do it to save pride, right? To save face. So he commanded that it be granted because of his oaths and his guests. Peer pressure. He's feeling peer pressure. So he sent orders and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. So apparently, Herodias, Philip's wife, didn't like John too much either. She didn't like having him say, "You can't be doing that. That's a wrong thing to do."
Imagine how twisted that is, that a young woman is happy and is actually holding
it's
a
pretty
platter
sick.
with another man's head on.
I know. It's pretty sick.
Well, if communists can go into a village and neuter all the little boys in there.
Alright, verse 12. Then his disciples came, removed the corpse, and went and reported it, buried it, and went and reported to Jesus. And that was John's disciples. John the Baptist had his disciples, and a disciple is just someone who learns from someone else. The word disciple and even the word discipline, it's a form of teaching. That's what discipling is. It's teaching, or discipline is it's something to teach. And so his disciples were people who were learning from him. And so John's disciples got his body, buried it, and went and talked to Jesus. Verse 13, when Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. All right, so I'm going to stop right here. This was Jesus' cousin, and he's grieving. This is an indication that he's grieving. And sometimes when we think of Jesus, we don't think of Jesus being emotional. But in the Bible, we see him get angry. We see him play with kids. We see him grieve. We see him cry. Be alone when he gets tired. So a lot of times we don't think of him really being human, but it's there. If you look for it, it is there. So when the crowds heard this, that he went off to be alone because of John the Baptist's death, they followed him on foot from the towns. As he stepped ashore, He saw a huge crowd, felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. So even though he's grieving, because this crowd comes to him, he feels bad for them, so he starts healing their sick. And if you've ever been grieving, I mean, probably he was emotionally, because he was grieving, he was likely even then predisposed to be compassionate toward them, because he felt their suffering, he understood their suffering, because he also was suffering. Verse 15, when evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "This place is a wilderness, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into villages and buy food for themselves." Verse 16, they don't need to go away. Jesus told them, "You give them something to eat." "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here," they said to him. "Bring them here to me." So he's kind of setting it up, right? "Bring them here to me," he said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was filled. Then they picked up 12 baskets of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And again, this is all, he went off to grieve. The crowd came to see him. He had compassion and healed them, and then he fed them, basically, because they stayed with him. And maybe on some level the crowds were mourning John the Baptist as well, because many people went to see John the Baptist, and so this might have been seeing John the Baptist beheaded, and especially the way that it happened, because a girl danced for him, might have had them really just kind of doubting and questioning things. But I want to say something here about me reading this, because reading through this, I've said it before, but it's almost like journaling for me, because as I read it out loud and think about it, things occur to me that maybe have not before. And I'm just kind of talking through my thoughts just as if I were writing things down. So that's kind of cool for me. But while I'm doing it, some of the things I'm saying, some of my thoughts and the way I'm interpreting things may not be accurate, but that's what the impression is for me. So some things aren't clear, they're just implied. Like, it doesn't even say Jesus is grieving, but it does say he goes off to be by himself. Well, to me, his cousin dies, he wants to be alone, he's grieving. And so when I read this, I'm thinking these things are happening while he's in his grief. But it doesn't say that explicitly. So someone else can read it and not get that necessarily from it. They might see something I don't see, or not see something I do see. And so I just want to kind of throw that out there, that when I'm reading through this, not everything I say, my interpretations may not necessarily be correct. But that's okay. I can be challenged on it. That's okay too. All right, verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him on the other, or to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. Okay, so now he's going to be by himself again. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself. So he fed them and then told them, go ahead of me. So he wants to be alone. When evening came, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already over a mile from land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Around 3 in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Immediately Jesus spoke to them. "Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter answered him, "command me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." All right, so one thing, and I read through that because I felt like that story should be gotten through before I commented, but one thing I never put together was that this event, him walking on the water, happened immediately after John was beheaded. He wants to be alone. He can't because the crowds come to him. He does what the crowds need, heals them, feeds them, sends them away, and goes to be alone and pray again. And then he's got to meet back up with his disciples, and that's when this happens. And I bring that up to say this, like sometimes when tragedy happens, when something devastating happens in life, sometimes things become clear that you couldn't see before. Sometimes you see beauty in life that you have not been able to see before because you were so caught up in everything going around. And tragedy just makes you stop. And I think John the Baptist's death was somewhat devastating because John the Baptist paved the way for Jesus to come and begin his ministry. And I think to many of the people, the crowds, it was probably devastating. What Peter and John, was it Peter and Andrew were John the Baptist's disciples before they moved to Jesus. And so it had to be upsetting to them as well. And maybe that's why Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Maybe Peter is in his grief and he's like, that's it. Whatever, he's kind of thrown, normal life is upside down and on its head. And so he says, you're on the water, I'm going to be on the water. You're grieving, I'm grieving. You're on the water, I'm going to be on the water too. So we don't know that, right? But maybe that's what's happening a little bit here. That's why he has the courage to step out, because life has just been turned upside down with the death of John the Baptist. That being said, and again, it's around 3 a.m, right? So it's in the middle of the night. So of course it's freaking him out to see somebody walking on the water. But what I always kind of saw with this is, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he says, come, and climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water. So he actually was walking on the water. And then he started looking around at everything going on, and he got afraid and started to sink. And that's so true in many areas of life. Like, you head out, I'm going to do this thing. And you get started and you start making progress, and then it just gets hard. And you get to noticing everything around, and you start doubting, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? But here's the thing, like he says, he started to doubt and he started to sink. And there's something to be said about having faith in your original commitment, because a lot of times we think a lot about making a big decision before we make it, and then we get in it and start doubting it. Well, we've done all the workings, the positive, the pro and the con columns and all that kind of stuff before we even make the decision, although I don't think Peter did that here. But then we start going on our way and we start questioning after the fact. Well, those things didn't necessarily change. The pros and the cons didn't necessarily change. But it's just not as simple as we thought it would be. And so we get afraid and begin to sink.
Something that I noticed that you didn't touch on, but you were touching on it, was that sometimes, even when we're grieving, there are going to be times where we're going to be called to still do things.
Yeah, when I did it,
that's what Jesus did.
Yeah,
like, people
that's right.
still needed him, even though he was grieving.
Right.
And he still had the patience, the kindness, the love.
He still healed them.
He still did what he was supposed to do.
He still fed them. Yeah. Yeah. And I did kind of like
allude to it.
Yeah. Right. I remember when my grandmother died, thinking it was so unfair that the sun was still shining, that it was a pretty day. It was beautiful. And it just seems so wrong. All right, verse 34. Once they crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized him, they alerted the whole vicinity and brought to him all who were sick. They were begging him that they might only touch the tassel on his robe, and as many as touched it were made perfectly well. And again, I think this kind of comes down to your faith. It's highlighted in Peter, and it's highlighted right here with the men touching the robe. When Peter had faith, he walked on water. When he doubted, he sank. And when people had faith that they would be healed by touching the tassel, they were made well. Okay, they were healed. So there's a lot to be said about belief in what you're doing, about believing and having faith that it's going to work out. All right, that's it. It seemed to go pretty quickly, but